right, welcome friends. We're excited that you are here. We're going to get started in just another minute or so. We know that we have some other friends joining us, and so we want to make sure that we have space for all the humans before we start. So we'll be starting soon.
If as you're coming in, you want to drop who you are, where you're coming to us from, what's your position, we'd love to hear who is with us, or I guess better, see who is with us. Thank you all for being here.
Love that you're here. I want to welcome those of you who are just joining. As you can see, Christina has encouraged folks to be dropping into the chat. Who's here? Where are you coming in from? What's the position that you have? We'll get started here in just a minute, but we do want to make sure that we create space for all the lovely humans that are supposed to be joining us. And so we want to wait just a couple minutes longer. Thanks for your patience and thanks for being here. All right, we're going to get started here in just one more minute. We know that there are a number of folks who are joining us from across the country and who knows where else. Across North America, I should be more inclusive even as we start for our Canadian friends. And we'll get started here in just another minute and then we'll jump in. All right, we are going to go ahead and get started in part because we have so much to share with you today and we're really excited to be able to dive in. Welcome to Cultivating a More Inclusive Recruitment Experience and Addressing Implicit Bias. This session is brought to you on behalf of the National Panhellenic Conference, and we are excited to be joining you and sharing some information with you as we go through today's session. We, again, have a lot of content to get through today, so we are going to use the chat for more engagement options. And because of that, we don't want to lose your questions in the chat. So if you have questions, we want to invite you to park those questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom webinar. That way it just holds Christina and I accountable as we go through the content to be able to make sure your questions are getting answered and that, again, they're not getting lost amongst the chat. As a reminder, though, if you are concerned about other people being able to see your question, you can always enter a question anonymously. And as a result of that, we'll make sure that that gets answered accordingly. My name is Dr. Suzette Walden-Cole. It is, again, a pleasure to be with you today. I serve as the senior partner, one of the senior partners for the Cross-Cultural Fraternal Advising Initiative Collaborative, which is the partnering organization that is working with MPC to try to address some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspects of the Panhellenic experience. I also serve as a professional speaker and consultant, tackling diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, and have been doing this work for a while, right? But in particular, as we think about this, I use the she, her, hers pronouns, and am thrilled to be here in part because I believe in the words of Maya Angelou that when we know better, we do better. And that serves as a guiding principle to try to address some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Christina?
Hello, everyone. My name is Christina Parle, like Carl, but with a P. So hello to the friends that I know on the call, and hello to all of the new friends that are here with us. Thank you so much. I use she, her, hers, they, them, their, either works. In my full-time job, I serve as the Director of Chapter Services and Conduct for Zeta Beta Tau Fraternity Headquarters, which means when the dudes get in trouble, they hang out with me. When they want to get educated, they hang out with me. And then I just serve as a general support. Similar to Suzette, I also am a professional speaker, consultant, do design of educational curriculum on the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we are super pumped to be here with you all. I truly believe that this is our social responsibility to care about this work, to give back in this work, and to educate others in this work. And so really excited to be here, and I'm excited that there's already a question in the Q&A. So keep those coming as we move along. One thing that we always want to do as much as we're able is to acknowledge the land that we are on. If you've never seen a land acknowledgement, we're super excited you're here to be able to do this with us today. But I want to acknowledge the land that I'm on. With COVID and everybody being spread out, there wasn't one singular place that we were able to choose. So Suzette and I decided to go with where we are. So I'm in Kansas City, Missouri. Shout out to my UMKC friend who is here and those at the University of Missouri. But Kansas City, Missouri was originally inhabited, of course, by indigenous people. And some of the earliest folks to live in Kansas City, Missouri were the Hopewell and Mississippi tribes. And then, of course, throughout time, the individuals that also lived on this land it was occupied by the Kickapoo tribe, the Osage Nation, the Kaw Nation, and the Sioux tribe. So I want to first start by acknowledging the land that I'm on, and then I'm also going to kick it over to Suzette to do that as well.
Thanks, Christina. I currently reside in Atlanta, Georgia, and for the land where my home is located, I also want to acknowledge the indigenous peoples who have occupied this area at some point in time. The Eastern Cherokee and the Lower Muskogee Creek tribes are the earliest identified as having occupied, again, the land where my home sits. We want to take this moment and opportunity to challenge you all to look up the land where you are and who it belongs to originally. And also within that, how you might provide your own land acknowledgement as part of creating that inclusive recruitment experience and inclusive experience period as we honor those individuals who are coming from indigenous identities. And we thank you for being present with us. Within that space, we want to also set up some supportive space expectations for our time together. We use the term supportive space because we don't know what it takes for you to feel safe, and we don't want to in any way presume that we would know what it took and takes for you to feel safe. So instead, we want to provide an environment that is supportive for exploration and sharing. We want to acknowledge that everybody's coming to this dialogue at different levels of knowledge and understanding. That gives us the opportunity to take advantage of the collective knowledge that exists within the various identities and lenses that are present today for our webinar, and also that may view it in the future as you examine your own community. We also want to share that we're going to talk through a number of recommendations and thoughts about how we can do a better job in the work of centering diversity, equity, and inclusion, and not just making it a box that you would check off. That requires a level of discernment. You know your communities better than Christina or I do, and so what works, for example, at a University of Southern California is not going to look the same as what works at a University of Georgia. And what works at a Stanford University is not going to be the same as what works at a Northwestern University. And so to hear that information and then to really think intentionally about how to apply it, that you're generous with grace and empathy. We have a tendency to desire a lot of grace and empathy for ourselves, but not offer it back to others. And for today, we want to focus on offering it to others. That this is a space for you to ask questions and gain clarity. Again, want to acknowledge the fact that we already have now 2 questions, Christina, up in the Q&A function. And so we'll definitely make sure that we get to those as we go through our time together today. And then finally, to set aside and to say, at some point in time, Christina may say something, I may say something, something may show up in the chat that is, in fact, emotionally activating for you. We use the language emotional activation or emotionally activating versus triggering, because triggers tied to trauma, and I don't have to have experienced a traumatic event to still get frustrated and angry and in my feelings about something that comes up in this space. And so do make sure that you're taking care of yourself as you need to as we go through the content today. Now, with that all being said, Christina is going to also talk about what do you need to do to be successful as you're viewing and engaging in this content today. Christina?
Yes, and I want to acknowledge that one of the questions is about a recording. And yes, this is being recorded. And yes, it will be sent out with a resource afterwards for those who have registered. So no worries there, Lucy. So what you will need to be successful, y'all, first is really that open heart and open mind. We all come to the table with a lot of different experiences and backgrounds. And so some of this is new for some of us, and some of us were like, look, Christina, I've been here my whole life, and I love that. All I ask is that we all have an open heart and an open mind to learning something new today, and always sharing what is that something new that you learned with us. We also ask that you're vulnerable. For our friends here who love Brene Brown, feel free to drop how much you love Brene Brown. But Brene talks about vulnerability really being doing something and not knowing what's going to come next, right? So that's what we ask, is that you're vulnerable, that you say things or ask things that you're not sure how it's going to be received, but so we can help you learn more, so we can help educate you and get your questions answered. We don't want you to leave here and have tons of questions that you were nervous about asking because you were worried. So again, feel free to chat us specifically, or to please put it in the Q&A if it's a question, and you can always do that anonymously. We also ask that you choose others over your own comfort. And what we mean by that is that we want you to get a little uncomfortable for the sake of caring for others, lifting others up, and doing what others need to be successful, to be heard, to be seen, to be valued, whatever that may look like, right? A lot of times we hear treat others how you would like to be treated. But we're going to ask you to treat others how they would like to be treated. And sometimes that means choosing them over what's comfortable for you. We also ask that you choose failure over silence. People are like, wait, what? We ask that you choose that failure because we are all going to mess this up. We are all at some point going to step in it, say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. Suzette and I do. This is a difficult topic. These aren't typical skills that we're honing throughout our lives. This isn't something that's being modeled for us every day. And so understanding that this is a journey, it is not a sprint, it will take time. A lot of times we get asked, Christina, Suzette, we love the little things that you're sharing with us, these little incremental changes we can make, but what's a big thing? What is a big, huge, massive thing that we could do that would make big change? And unfortunately, I'm here today to share with you that there really isn't anything, because y'all, the little things become the big things. So if we can make these little incremental changes over time, that turns into the big stuff. We're a very on-demand type of society. I 100% am like that. But we have to realize that we have to put stuff out there, be consistent in it, and then eventually people will start to see us differently. So you all could have the most inclusive recruitment you've ever had in the history of your institution this upcoming term, and people might still not trust it until they see that consistency and they see you doing those little things every single day to help turn into those big things. Also, for my friends who love the Instant Pot, I'm one of those friends, right? That's me. Is that the Instant Pot is great. You can get your food in 10 minutes, maybe 15, maybe a little bit longer if you're cooking something real detailed, versus the slow cooker where we're like, okay, I could throw it in there and I could come back to it maybe in the morning or tonight. This work, y'all, is not an Instant Pot. It is not going to happen in 10 minutes. You are not going to leave this webinar and be like, oh, I'm different. I got it all on lock. I can do this. It's going to be a slow cooker. It's going to take time. And then as, when we think about like what you'll need to be successful, these are all ways that you can learn to engage in this way with us. And so let's talk a little bit about some shared language, right? We want to make sure always that we're on the same page about what we mean when we say the words we're saying. Diversity is a great example of when we all are on different pages about what diversity means. Suzette thinks it means diversity of race. I think it means diversity of personality. The other person thinks it means diversity in major. So let's just all get on the same page. Diversity is really about that difference, right? The different identities, backgrounds, perspectives, everything that we bring as a unique being. But also there's this caveat piece of it's also about how people perceive and receive the world, and how the world and those in it perceive and receive us based on all of those identities, perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences. And then there's equity. Equity a lot of times gets lost in this conversation because in a lot of ways it's a lot harder. And some of us have also not made the transition from equality to equity, and understanding what we're really looking for is equity. Because the truth is, y'all, equity is about that fair treatment, access to an opportunity to participate as our full selves. It's all about eliminating barriers to doing that, to that fair treatment, to that access and opportunity. Then when we think about inclusion, inclusion is all about creating an environment where I feel heard and seen and valued and validated. Think about it as a table, right? Everybody can be hanging out in the room, which is diversity, but pulling up that seat to the table and being able to be heard and seen and those kinds of things is where inclusion really starts to kick in. So then from there, let's talk a little bit about intent versus impact. We'll talk more in depth about this later, but I want to be clear. Intent versus impact typically occurs when something negative has happened, right? And somebody is saying, oh, well, that wasn't my intent. Well, the truth is, y'all, although intent is an important part of whatever decision you've made to say or do something, it doesn't negate the impact that you potentially had on someone else, whether known or unknown, right? And so really thinking about intent and impact both as being important rather than just, well, only my intent matters. Both matter. And then thinking about intersectionality. If you have not heard the name Kimberly Crenshaw, make a note in your phone, on a sheet of paper, whatever, but look her up. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the concept of intersectionality, which means being biracial and Black, being a woman, being agnostic, being straight, and how all of those things intersect for me to create a unique experience. It's also this concept of how my identities intersect to create privilege for myself or to marginalize who I am, right? And so those aren't things that I can change, but the way in which our society is set up allows for those intersections to create unique experiences. It's also the difference between I'm Black and biracial and Suzette's white, but we're both women. And how do we share an experience as women? But how do our experiences kind of diverge because of those other identities that we have? Then a couple of quick, shorter definitions. Bias, which is that prejudice or preference for a specific group or against another group, which we'll get into more as we go along. Power is really that ability to have access to resources and the capacity to kind of direct and influence the behaviors of others in the course of events. Then when we think about privilege, this is always a hard one typically for folks. Privilege is that unearned access to or resource or power, right? And so really thinking about how we didn't ask for it, we didn't ask for that privilege, but we got it anyways based on how our society is set up. And so lastly, thinking about tokenization, love that there was already a question in the Q&A about tokenization. Y'all, tokenization is really about wanting to prevent criticism by tokenizing somebody to show, oh, well, look at us. Or it's a way to give the appearance that these types of people or humans are welcome in our space based on tokenizing somebody in that regard. Suzette, is there anything that you would add to any of those?
No, I think you did a wonderful job of setting a baseline. You know, one of the reasons why we spend time right in the very beginning is so that there can be a common language as we go through. So often, as Christina highlighted, I just want to amplify that point. You jump into talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion within your community without actually defining what it is that you mean as a Panhellenic, as an exec, or coming together to come up with what that shared language looks like within your community. The question came up on Wednesday night session about, can we use the definitions that you all have provided within our community? And the answer is absolutely. We welcome you doing that as you feel comfortable and confident in doing so. Now, we want to take just a moment. Oftentimes, especially right now, we're dealing with so many competing priorities and juggling so many things that we don't take the time for self-reflection. So we're going to ask you to take a quick minute, the power of a minute. It can feel real long as a heads up for the virtual space. So this is an excellent, right, precursor to many of you who are getting ready to engage in the virtual recruitment. But we want to give you a power minute to reflect and take a sheet of paper and a pen, open up a note on your phone, open up a note on your laptop. If you're gathered together in some location, use dry erase board, whatever that looks like for you. But identify traits, characteristics, things that you think about when you think about what is a truly inclusive recruitment experience look like and feel like in action. So we're going to give you a power minute to do that self-reflection starting now. I told y'all the minute can feel really long. So we want to create an opportunity now for you to share some of the things that you generated. We welcome and invite you to drop into the chat some of those points that you articulated in writing. And you can, again, send those to all panelists and attendees or send it directly to all panelists. If you do the latter, we won't name where it's coming from. We'll assume that you want privacy in that regard, but want to see a little bit about what you're thinking when it comes to inclusivity in the recruitment experience. Giving an equal chance to all women coming through, not discriminating. Appreciate that. Reception of good feedback from P&Ms, row gammas or recruitment counselors, other houses, etc. More listening, less talking. We appreciate you for that. An inclusive recruitment experience looks like a community that is unconsciously and subconsciously allowing individuals from all backgrounds to be interested in a process that will not degrade them based on their race, sexual orientation, or body type. I really want to appreciate that, Michael, from the standpoint of body type. And we'll talk more about different aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but that becomes a true piece that a lot of times we don't think about when we start thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. When welcoming all potential sisters, no matter their race, ethnicity, class, or language, really getting to know them and being open-minded. Appreciate that. Also, Jasmine, again, adding to that depth, and we'll talk about that depth with the class and language component. Transparency in describing the sorority experience. Woo! Transparency becomes important. Both financial transparency, the time commitment of transparency, and being more representative of what we need to look like. Inclusivity in recruitment means that all women don't feel as though they are defined or judged based on their backgrounds or sexual orientation. So got a lot of that. And then I love accepting, kind, non-taxing ability to openly discuss values instead of perceptions on surface level relations, parties, and events. Appreciate the contributions there. One of the things that we just want to offer is even in how you're defining sorority experience. And granted, I just was scrolling through, and so I may have missed this, but one of the things that we want to challenge you on is, do you reference Panhellenic formal recruitment? Or on your campus, are you using sorority recruitment? Because if it's the latter, if you are just referencing sorority recruitment in the language that you're using in your social medias or in the advertisements, if you're not referencing it as Panhellenic recruitment, then we're erasing a whole aspect of the culturally based sororities on your campus. And so we really want to be mindful about language and the importance of language, especially when we start integrating conversations around inclusion and what that looks like. And I would be remiss if I didn't use this as a teachable moment for us to frame that as we go forward. Now, Christina's going to talk to us a little bit about centering diversity, equity, and inclusion and why that matters. Christina, anything else before we pivot to that?
Yeah, I think there's a question in the Q&A that can be a quick answer. One of our friends wrote, I like how privilege is defined here. I think we definitely see this in recruitment with legacies. How can we do away or change this to be more inclusive? This is a common concern, of course, and sometimes there's a misconception of who can change or do away with legacies. So we want to make it very clear that the legacy policy is very specific to the international or national organization. And so if you have concerns about the legacy policy, that should be going directly to that international or national organization. The Panhellenic Council doesn't have any specific I guess, jurisdiction, for lack of a better word, over the legacy policy. So really being thoughtful about how we're pushing our international and national organizations to consider or do more in this area. So let's talk a little bit about, why diversity, equity, and inclusion matters, right? Many of us, probably most, say that we want women in our organization. And we even say we want to empower women. When we talk about women, that means all women. Doesn't matter any other identity that they have, but we have to be talking about the all rather than the stereotypical Panhellenic sorority woman or the stereotypical PNM that we're looking for or member that we're looking for. Because y'all, humans don't show up to recruitment and shed certain parts of their identities. They don't just show up as people or women or Black or white or with disabilities or without disabilities. They show up as all of who they are in all of those different social groupings that we tend to see. So being really thoughtful about that is why diversity, equity, and inclusion is so incredibly important. Many of you have probably heard over the course of your life to be tolerant of difference or accepting of difference. And the truth of the matter is that in 2020, people are demanding that they be respected, that their humanity be respected. And humanity being all of that difference that they bring to the table, whether it makes us comfortable or uncomfortable. And so acknowledging that diversity, equity, and inclusion is so incredibly tied to people's humanity is important, because in that same conversation is the concept of mental health. In fraternity and sorority, we love to talk about our members' mental health. And we can't talk about mental health without also talking about recruitment and how sometimes it can be really anxiety inducing. It can tear down people's self-esteem in the current way that we've been doing it. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes so much more important, because when we talk about that concept of being seen and heard and valued and validated in regards to inclusion is directly tied back to mental health. Humans have a desire to belong as people, right? And recruitment is really that way in which we're doing that. And so thinking about how we are excluding humans through the recruitment process in whatever way, and we'll get into more examples as we go along. It's also very fascinating that diversity tends to come up typically around recruitment. It's when we're talking about it most. And we got to be talking about this concept 365. We have to be caring about this as much as we do when we're trying to recruit them as when they're members. Because if you create a temporary sense of belonging, where as a PNM, I'm like, oh my gosh, they're so great, I can't wait to be there. Then I get into the chapter and it's really exclusive. There's a lot of bias, hate is happening. You've bamboozled them a little bit, right? Like you've tricked them by creating this sense of temporary belonging that they were not going to get once they get there. And so thinking about how recruitment and diversity, equity, and inclusion go hand in hand, because the topic of authenticity is something that we often talk about, and you cannot be authentic without being able to show up as your whole self. We also want you all to be change agents. Your future employers are likely going to care that you have some level of education on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so if all of that humanity, emotional stuff didn't vibe with you or doesn't vibe with others, there's also this real concept of it's going to be expected of us as we go further into our lives, our experiences, our careers. This is an expectation. But the reality is that if we want Panhellenic to continue to be relevant, we have to figure this conversation out. We have to figure diversity, equity, and inclusion out as well as we know RFM, or as well as we know risk management. DE&I has to become a framework and has to be infused and weaved into everything that we do, or we will lose our relevancy as Panhellenic sororities. I think the other piece is that our stereotypical or traditional P&M pool, the way they look or the identities that they have, is shrinking. The truth is the world is probably going to look a little bit more like me than it does like our current predominant Panhellenic women do, because the world is changing, right? And so thinking about what the world's going to look like and how we can continue to be relevant in that space. So let's talk a little bit about identity, right? You've heard us talk a lot about social identities, which are those things of body size, age, socioeconomic status, level of education, what's your first language, what's your national origin, do you have a disability, those different kinds of things. And we want to distinguish that from personal identities, because personal identities are really the things that I get to choose. I get to choose that I'm a fur mom and I have a 4-year-old dog and I get to be his mom. I get to choose that I want to be a singer because I've honed that skill and I've worked on it. I get to choose to be a Grey's Anatomy enthusiast. I hope everyone here is too, right? Because those are the things that I've decided. My social identities aren't typically things that I get to choose. almost never, other than the concept maybe of religion, am I getting to kind of choose to believe or not believe whatever type of faith. But most of these things are not choice based. They're who I am. They're how I was born into this world, and have learned to develop over time. Identity exploration is also a process, y'all. A lot of folks think, oh, well, because Christina's Black biracial, she gets all of that. She really understands what it means to be Black biracial. Well, the reality is I didn't really start developing racially until I was probably about 20 or 21. Because of the lived experiences that I had had. I lived in a very white world, both in my family, K through 12. It really wasn't until I was in my second or third year of college where I started to be pushed more. And so identity exploration doesn't just happen. It's a process, and it's something that many of us have to engage in intentionally in order to do work. And then lastly, identity in a lot of ways is a social construct. Many of the identities that we have, particularly when we think about social identities, were created. Now, would I have still been the color that I am? Absolutely. But somebody assigned the word Black or the word biracial or the word white to that. It's just like time. If you think about time, you're like, oh, we all have 24 hours. How did that happen? Who created the 24 hours and who created the minute and the hour? And you're like, oh gosh, I'm going down a rabbit hole. But social identity is very similar in that way. It is socially constructed based on how we as a society have categorized it or labeled it or said it works. And that becomes the systemic issue that we see. So in relation to identity, I want to make sure that we spend at least a couple of minutes talking about the concept of intersectionality. And so intersectionality is really, again, going back to that concept of the different ways in which I show up that create a unique experience for me. The importance about intersectionality is when somebody says, hey, Suzette, can you speak on behalf of all women? Suzette would be like, well, no, because I'm a white woman. I'm a straight woman. And there are other women out there who are not white or not straight. And those intersections of those identities is what makes that conversation so challenging, or that question so challenging to answer. As I kind of touched on just a second ago, there's also this concept of saliency when we're talking about identity. Saliency really means what's most important to me, what do I think about most, what impacts me the most. And so again, I might present as Black, but the reality is that that might not be the thing I think about most or is most important to me or impacts me the most. Now, for me, being Black biracial is super important, but also age is just as important to me because I tend to experience a lot of discrimination in that way. I challenge you to think about what is salient for you when it comes to your identities and how the identities that you think about the most are typically linked to your oppression or marginalization, and how the identities that maybe you think about the least are sometimes tied to your privilege, right? I don't think a lot about having the ability to walk because that's a privilege. I don't have to think about moving about in this world because the world was built for people like me in that regard. So really thinking about saliency in that way. The other piece is about intersectionality and the sorority experience. Right now, y'all, we're talking a lot about race, which I love. I think it's great, especially with the current unrest that's going on and the recent murders that have happened, but of course have been happening for years, decades, centuries. And I love that we're having an awakening right now, but the reality is, y'all, one of my favorite social activists talks about you can't fight oppression in one corner and cheer it on in the other. So this fight that we're fighting has to be intersectional. Because if you fix every issue for people of color, for Black folks, for Indigenous folks, for BIPOC people, Black, Indigenous people of color, they're still going to be challenged and marginalized in other areas because of intersectionality. So you can fix every issue for them, and some of them will still have disabilities. Some of them will still be international. Some of them still won't have English as their first language. So thinking about how intersectionality impacts the larger conversation. Suzette, is there anything that you would add?
I think, part of what stirs for me, Christina, always when we talk about this idea of intersectionality is how how we're thinking about and treating the big change with the small change conversation, right? I think about the callback to what you shared with respect to Instant Pot versus the slow cooker. And the reason why I think about that is because if you have an inclusive recruitment experience, but you don't have an intentionally inclusive community, then it won't matter, right? If we still have microaggressions happening and cultural appropriation happening and acts of bias happening within our community, then we're still going to fall short, even in how we navigate. Because now we've got maybe greater representation in, but we're not prepared for support or how to engage in the membership experience. You know, I want us to think about how we're centering members and new members within our community. That you know, we talk often about food, for example. If your facility, and I get with the COVID, things are a little up in the air, but if you have a sorority facility or you offer food at events and activities, are you naturally having gluten-free options, kosher options? Are you thinking about how to build inclusion within your current sisterhood, within your current Panhellenic communities? When we think about issues associated with language, if you're at a Hispanic serving institution, do you automatically have bilingual recruitment materials? If you are at an institution that has a high population of French Caribbean influenced nations, do you have bilingual materials that would also be in French? And some of you may be panicking like, oh my gosh, we've never thought about that. But part of that language piece comes into leaning into the institution, because if they have admissions materials, then they likely already have somebody who can provide that service to you, as opposed to leaning in even to one of your own members to do that translation. Right? We want to get it professionally done to make sure it's accurate. And we also don't want to tokenize, which we'll talk about in a little bit. The idea of building inclusive communities becomes important even when we're thinking about faith. Are we being mindful around avoiding Jewish high holidays, Muslim holidays, etc., even when we're scheduling mandatory Panhellenic events and or recruitment itself, right? Because if we're not doing that, if we're not thinking those things through, then the covert messages, the subtle messages, and we'll talk here in a few moments more specifically about implicit bias, the undercurrent is that we aren't inclusive. So building inclusive communities can often lead us to places where we increase diversity and representation. And thinking about these things more holistically allows us to create that opportunity. From an abledness standpoint, when we're thinking about what rooms we're using, are they accessible? When we're thinking about the spaces that we're engaging, even for the virtual recruitment, are we judging people, or have we had conversations about how not to judge people who maybe don't have sustainable Wi-Fi connection for being able to use their video? And so they're only going to be able to call in or access it in that way. How can we think about those issues more holistically as it relates to intentionally creating inclusive spaces? Christina, I see you unmuted, ready to rock and roll. I'm guessing to speak to this question that's popped up in the chat, or something.
Yeah, about customs. About customs. I just want to make sure you saw it.
Yeah. So the custom piece, where are we? I'm going to let you jump in.
Oh, yeah, that's why I just wanted to make sure that you had seen it and that we would get an answer. A lot of times, y'all, I think customs really is related to traditions, right? Like things that we, within a culture, are custom for us to do. So when I think about the Jewish faith, there are probably customs or things that are appropriate based on the traditional men and women and shaking hands depending on marriages, or if they're rabbis. There are customs related to how people interact, depending on the different culture. Suzette?
Yeah, I love that. The other piece about customs is even in big little reveals, right? That's a custom of our sororities in many instances. And so, are we being inclusive about those customs? Are we thinking about how to make sure that we're not going to place somebody in a position of being embarrassed or being in a situation where they're uncomfortable? That's what we mean when we're talking about customs. Appreciate the question. I was looking at the chat, not looking at the Q&A, even though we said use the Q&A, so I appreciate you helping us this out. The other thing, and that I want to speak to really relatively quickly, is intentionally creating an inclusive space within the sorority fraternity experience, because I know that this NPHC, the National Panhellenic Organization, we've gotten questions about that. What does that mean? What does that look like? Here's what we'll offer to you. When you're marketing the sorority experience, are you speaking to the fact that Panhellenic groups are one pathway to enter that experience? Or are you speaking to it from a standpoint of, here's the experience, and within whatever marketing materials we have, we're going to define what it looks like for these different options and opportunities. That becomes really important. And even within the sharing of information, especially in this virtual environment, are we allowing our culturally based groups to maybe do a video to talk about what their sorority experience is like, not from a standpoint of recruiting members, but from a standpoint of informing members or the community about what those organizations offer that is different. Now, we got a question on Monday night that was, well, what about what if we start doing that? Are we going to be, taking members from culturally based groups? No. Here's what we used as a nugget of knowledge on Wednesday. I'm going to use it again here. Zeta Phi Beta Sorority Incorporated has accepted all races since 1955. And I would doubt that we've hurt their membership, right? And I would doubt that they're doing that has hurt Panhellenic membership, because people that join culturally based organizations are looking for a different experience than are people who are joining Panhellenic groups. There is a different identity support level that comes into play. Christina, anything you would tack on to that?
Yeah, our friend Gina has, been commenting in the chat, helping me understand the question. I think what is important, though, is that if there is no education on the front end about the differences, you're going to run into issues. So if you have like an MGC, a DGC, IGC, depending on what you call it, and an NPHC, both of which potentially have sororities, maybe on your registration, you make it really clear this recruitment is only for these chapters on campus. If you were interested in MGC, here's your point of contact. And those would be these organizations that are cultural based and affiliated with Southeast Asian or Latinx or whatever. Or, here's NPHC. If you're interested in historically Black fraternities and sororities, here's their contact information. So you all could be doing that work for the PNMs on the front end. I'll never forget in my own experience being in a room full of women. I'm a first generation college student, Panhellenics up front, and I'll never forget them saying, and if you're interested in the NPHC orgs, you can go with them in the back. And I, as a first generation college student, I was like, what is NPHC? I barely know what Panhellenic is. I'm just here, trying to learn more. And so I didn't get up because there was no good explanation of what that meant. And so you all could be doing the work on the front end to be very clear, both on your fraternity and sorority websites, but also in your registration process with PNMs about the differences between the different orgs. Because to Suzette's point, some people who join Panhellenic are truly looking for the Panhellenic experience, and those who are joining cultural-based orgs are looking for that experience because the two are in fact different. So that's all I would add, Suzette.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just want to speak to a point that Gabby put in the chat, and I would agree with you, Gabby, to some extent that you feel like it's assumed that they're looking for something different. I think part of it though is that many times they are, right. We're not. Neither Christina nor I would ever use an absolutist language, like they're always looking for this or they're always looking for that. In part because that's where intersectionality, to amplify, right, her point earlier, that's where intersectionality comes in, because people are looking for different things, but how we're talking about those sorority experiences are very different. There's an emphasis on service differently in oftentimes in culturally based groups than there is, right, in Panhellenic groups. And so I want to make sure that there's some clarity around that. Appreciate that. That sort of call in, so to speak, or point being raised. Why and where this matters and how this comes up also, though, speaks to how we're marketing that experience and thinking about what that looks like and why identity matters, why we're spending this much time unpacking that before we pivot and move into other spaces. Because I want to go back and again echo and amplify what Christina shared with you about centering diversity, equity, and inclusion within the work of Panhellenic, that it cannot just be something that the vice president for recruitment is taking care of, or it cannot be something that as a Panhellenic, we just create a diversity, equity, and inclusion officer to have that box be checked. It has to be something that centers these things and where we have the opportunity to explore and unpack why identity matters, because it really shapes the things that you see on the screen. It really shapes the things that you see on the screen, and our ability, if all I do when I scroll through the Insta feed is humans in bikinis, right? That doesn't help me feel confident coming into the space. And we'll talk more specifically about recruitment and inclusion here in this next section. In order to get a pulse check, a quick pulse check, because we've been talking at you for a while, we want to create an opportunity for you to engage differently. And so I'm going to launch a poll for you to be able to weigh in on, and ask that you and or the humans who are associated around you take a moment to answer the questions that you see on the screen. We'll give you just a minute to do that. Okay, a lot of responses coming in or trickling. It's like a slow drip, Christina, like a slow drip. The beauty is we know that it takes a little bit of time. Okay, we'll give it another minute. 2/3 of the way there. All right. In the polling in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so I'm going to share the results with everybody. Christina, this is what we're looking like. We got a majority that says we definitely need work. And kind of balancing that with that tie of we're a work in progress with progress in sight. So that's good. Regardless of where you are on the spectrum, we're going to talk about how and what this can look like for you and for your community. In terms of the authentically themselves, interesting. We have the I do, but I'm unsure what others would say. Here's a great thing that you can do is make sure that you're assessing your community, doing some assessment. How did people feel in the recruitment experience? How, both from the recruiter side as well as, right, from the potential new member side, not being afraid to allow for that anonymous feedback as well, to talk about that experience. That's how, again, when we know better, we do better, and assessment's a pathway to guide us there. And then finally, it looks like as recruiters, our chapters and recruitment counselors are definitely guilty of putting on the mask. We have this sometimes piece being that majority there, seconded by the absolutely. Here's what we want you to think about as we make the pivot to identity and recruitment, which Christina is going to pick up on, is if I'm giving so much energy to wearing the mask, how does that impact my confidence? How does that resonate and jive with when we say we want you to be your authentic selves? And think about how much energy it takes to wear that mask. And when you think about those things, we want you to think about, for our potential new members who are going to be joining us in these virtual spaces, we may not know if they're out at home, if there are other aspects of their identity that they feel like they have to hold reserved in order to participate, because we don't know where they're participating from. And so those are some of the things that we want you to think about as we make the transition. And Christina is going to unpack many more of these as we talk about identity and recruitment. Christina?
Yeah, so we also got a question about why we use the word humans instead of people. It's kind of funny because we presented a couple nights ago and got the same question. I think for us, it's the most inclusive way to talk about humans or people. I think humans and people can be interchangeable for some, not for all. And so I think it's also just kind of a fun way to reference humans, because it's like, wait, we don't talk like that. And so it's another way to kind of get out of our comfort zone with words and with language, and an easy way to be really inclusive of a lot of folks. So thank you for offering the question. Suzette?
I was just going to say, it also gives us the opportunity to honor the humanity, right, of the individual. And I think sometimes when you use people, it can feel no different than when I use animal. And when we use humans and humanity, in my mind, that references the fact that there are feelings, there's an impact that's going to happen from that. So I just wanted to highlight that as well. Thanks, Christina.
Absolutely. And so y'all, when we think about the concepts of identity and recruitment, the reality is that some identity is going to be visible to you and some identities are going to be invisible to you. And so being really thoughtful about how we show up in the space, regardless of what we can see or not see, is vitally important when you think about creating an inclusive space. It's also that knowing identity is important, but it's not the entire thing. And it shouldn't be the only reason that you're choosing people. We tend to get the thought of, we're worried that people are going to choose people of color just because they're people of color. We always have to be asking ourselves the why. So why are we posting this picture? Why are we trying to recruit this person? Is it because they would make a good addition to our chapter because of X, Y, and Z, or they they believe in our standards and our values and they would uphold those things? Really thinking deeper than just, oh, well, this person has a disability or this person has that. Like, do you genuinely get along with them? And do you believe they would be a great addition to your space? And then thinking about this concept of logistics to showtime. Suzette's already talked to us a little bit about scheduling and being thoughtful about holidays and experiences and things that are happening at certain times of the year, other than just Christian holidays or US holidays. But also, we have to be thinking about our room setup. If you're doing recruitment in a chapter facility, is it ADA accessible? If you're doing it on campus, is that space ADA accessible? Are we thinking about body type and shape and size when we're thinking about outfits? I constantly have to remind some of the humans that I work with, because I do recruitment for Sigma Kappa, I constantly have to remind them that just because you were the person deciding the outfits doesn't mean those outfits work for everybody. So are you thinking about your entire chapter when you're thinking about size? and the outfits that might go with that. I love the humans who have said, we've done away with just black dresses. We're doing black dresses and jumpsuits and rompers. And absolutely, clothing is an outward expression of us. And so allow people to show up in the space in which they feel confident. We also have some serious concerns about hair discrimination, and people saying you need to put heat to your head, or you need to curl your hair, or you need to straighten it. Here's the reality, y'all. If y'all would have told me to straighten my hair when I was in college, my hair wasn't like this. But now I'd have been like, oh, that's cute. No. So thinking about how we are creating a space where we say, when have you felt the most confident in your life? When have you wanted to say, Suzette, take 500 pictures of me today because I look good? And do your hair that way, right? Just be clear that you don't want them to look like they just got up out of bed. And the same with their outfits, right? Like not everybody has to look the same. And for those of you who are going to be virtual, this is about how much you're going to be able to see. So who cares? And the P&M, again, as long as the humans don't look like they just rolled out of bed, shouldn't care either. That's a really traditional thing that we have always done that doesn't have to be, right? Also really thinking about if you're going to have visuals, whether virtually or in person, are you using captions? Are you thinking about the color scale and the challenge for those who might have some visual impairments? Being really, really thoughtful about the videos or pictures or things that we're going to be showing. Also, our social media, this is where tokenization comes into play, and Suzette's going to talk to us a little bit about tokenization next. But thinking about what Suzette talked about with, is everybody in a bikini? Is everybody climbing a mountain? Is everybody blowing glitter? Let's get some realness on your social media pages. What are you doing in your everyday lives as a chapter or individually that would be cool for the P&Ms to see, that make them feel like, oh, I could be with them there because I love to eat popcorn and watch movies. I love to hang out and be in my pajamas, whatever it is, but really being thoughtful about what we're showing to the world, especially with COVID going on. The world is not all sunshine and rainbows. Most people are not on beaches hanging out or climbing mountains. Let's be real about what our experience looks like. I want you all to think about these two questions, particularly those of you who are leading recruitment or have some stake in it. What does your all's recruitment strategy say about you and your chapter, right? Whether it's at a chapter level or a community-wide. What does your recruitment strategy say about you all? But also, what environment are you trying to achieve? What have you all said you all want it to be? What do you want your chapter to look like? And are those two things aligned, or do they diverge, right? Is your strategy not in line with the actual environment you want to create? Because those two should be aligned. And a lot of ways in which they diverge is when we try to put all these things in place that are fake and inauthentic and not real in comparison to what our everyday experiences are like. Suzette, is there anything that you would add?
I don't think so. I want to use this though as a moment to be able to pivot into recognizing how and when tokenization or and why tokenization shows up, because in the Q&A piece, right, somebody said, well, how do you reconcile someone being able to, or telling chapters that you want them to show their best selves without wearing a mask? I think I just want to lean into what Christina just said, right? When do they feel most confident? Because if the true value, right, of the sorority experience within Panhellenic organizations is that sense of sisterhood, belonging, support, that I'm going to have this group of humans that are going to be able to help lift me up on my worst day and help celebrate with me on my best day, then why are we showcasing something that is not a reality? Like, I don't know that we have really thought about what the blowing of glitter has to do with anything. I don't know when that became cute. I really will be honest with you, because I don't understand what that has to do with the value of being a member of the organization. And I appreciate, you know, Megan throwing in, my sorority sister actually has an allergy to glitter. So we make an effort to order shirts and craft without it. I think that's great, right? When you think about what this looks like, tokenization is asking someone to speak on behalf of the entire group. Christina highlighted that example earlier, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time there, but I'm going to focus instead on this idea of right now there seems to be this emphasis on trying to showcase that we aren't the stereotype of sorority experience. And I appreciate that. We want to be careful that we're highlighting the trueness of who we are. So not using it, thinking back to the definition that Christina provided to you at the very beginning, not using it as an opportunity for us to escape, critique, criticism, etc. That we're not featuring prominently the sorority who is non-hetero and celebrating the fact that we're saying we're open to all sexual orientations, that we're not featuring a sister who is struggling with mental health and asking our ability to showcase her and her story, or they and their story about what it means, right, to have a sister that support me through my mental health challenges. If it is part of an ongoing series, right, where we're featuring all different sisters and we're highlighting their experiences and telling their stories, that's different, right? It's different because we're opening it up and everyone's going to share their story, or we're picking, and by picking, we've opened it up to highlight, right, 3 or 4 sisters from different membership classes of sorts, right? And to be able to do that, or we do a call to say, hey, if you'd like to participate, we want to highlight you. And then I can self-identify as wanting to participate. That tokenizing goes to where when you have the humans who push back on, well, we don't need to pander. I'm going to try to hit some of these mini questions up in here. We don't need to pander to the pressure. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is going to fade. Well, first of all, we want to be good humans. Like, I thought that when we said we wanted to empower women and that the Panhellenic sorority experience was designed to do that, that NPC as a whole is like, you know, moving forward together in this piece, that naturally infuses diversity, equity, and inclusion. When you're setting the dues for, you know, the structure of these things, tokenization comes in and it creeps in all these places and spaces because we speak to one person who may come from a low socioeconomic background. We speak to one person who may come from a fuller figured background. We speak to one person who represents this identity and we say, hey, is this okay? And then, depending upon what they say, that determines whether or not we feel like we need to do anything. And that's not okay. So an area of challenge within the recruitment and marketing experience of how we market ourselves and the Panhellenic sorority experience has to be more thoughtful and thought-filled. And as part of that thoughtful and thought-filledness, we also want to think about the impacts of our language. Christina, anything that you would tack on before we pivot to language?
Yeah, I want to make it really clear. A lot of folks are heavily focusing on diversity, which I love, that's great. But what I want you to do for a second is put diversity to the side, just for a second. Because truthfully, y'all, diversity does not lead to inclusion. You're not going to have a diverse space that then is going to lead to an inclusion. And I can give you great examples, probably tons of them, of chapters that are diverse who are not able to be inclusive, and so there is constant strife. They're being problematic, they're being harmful, they're being hurtful. I want you to flip those and think about how can you create an inclusive space that is welcoming to all people. If you build it, they will come. If you create this inclusive space, they will show up because they will know, well, everybody is welcomed in X space. So there was a question about how do we become more diverse if we don't have anybody who's diverse? Become inclusive. Create spaces that are welcoming to all people. Do programming on your campus that shows that you all are inclusive. Show on your social media all of the work that you all are doing to be inclusive. Create an inclusive space, and diversity and that representation that you all are looking for will come. Again, knowing that this is not an instant pot, it's a slow cooker, and they're gonna need to see that consistency. When we think about language, this is one of our main forms of communication, y'all, and particularly those for you who are doing virtual recruitment, it's one of the only things that you're going to be able to rely on. And in those first few minutes of an interaction, what is telling me if you care about me, if I'm safe with you, if you're going to judge me, is your words. So I need everybody to think about what words you're using every day. Think about the last 3 conversations that you've had. And what do your words say about you? The reality is about language is you don't have to be woke to use the right words, right? You just have to care more about people than you do about the burden of changing your words, because it really doesn't impact us to say, they instead of her, or to use the word Black instead of African American, to use the words and things that work for other people, right? To not say, hey girls, when we really mean women, because everybody's a grown up typically that we're around in our spaces. So really thinking about our words and understanding that we're going to mess it up. Again, we are going to step in it, and that's okay, but we need to be able to commit to being better next time. Our language is so important as well in relation to intent versus impact. Sometimes I say something and I didn't mean for it to be harmful, but the impact is that it was. I remember asking one of my supervisees about what he did with his mom and dad over the holiday. And he said, well, my mom's dead. And my heart fell through my body because I never intentionally meant to hurt him. But now I'm in some ways potentially re-traumatizing him by not realizing that his mother had passed. It wasn't information that he had ever shared with me, but why did I even ask the question? I could have just said, what'd you do with your family over the holidays? And that would have allowed him to say whatever he wanted to say. When we think about words, some of the words that come to mind that are particular to recruitment is when we're saying, hey guys, and we're in a room full of women or non-binary folks. You would never call a room full of masculine people or men, hey ladies or hey girls. So thinking about how sometimes our language keeps systems alive. The same goes for the future is female. Not all of the humans who are coming through recruitment identify as female. Some of them are trans women who may not have gone through any types of surgeries to become one or the other, right? So thinking about that of like, future is female is not inclusive of everybody. It could be the future is feminine. It could be the future is fluid. It could be the future is everyone, whatever you want it to be. But what I really want you all to think about again is, what do your words, what are the things that are coming out of your mouth say about you? Suzette, is there anything that you would add to that?
No, I think you did a great job summarizing those points. I want to challenge us to think about other factors also that create that inclusive experience. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but I really want to offer the idea of embracing authentic conversations, right? Not being afraid to model vulnerability, especially for where we are and how we're navigating. Is Panhellenic prepared to embrace these factors? Are the member group chapters prepared to embrace these factors? Focusing on the values of the Panhellenic community, celebrating the sisters we have from all identities and backgrounds in ways that don't tokenize them, but highlight them for what the experience is really meant to be. And then speaking transparently about the cost and time commitments of membership. We've said that before, I want to say it again, and evaluating why the cost is what it is. Do we need to have some of the big ticket items that we do? Do we need to charge what we're charging? How can we make the experience more accessible and more affordable. It may surprise you to know that both Christina and I joined our respective organizations as juniors. Part of what played into that for me was that I had to save in order to be able to afford to join. And so that transparency becomes really important. And if we're centering the P&M in conversations, then it allows us to not have the same conversation over and over again. Every conversation should look a little bit different. Christina talked to you about intent versus impact. She talked to you about the language piece. I think it's important, especially as we think about the virtual space, that we not assume that P&M, is going to know your intent, or that you're even going to have the opportunity to explain it. And so it's going to stand for itself. This is why bias becomes such an important component to the conversation. Bias begins to shape our version of the truth, which can lead to discrimination and lead to oppression if it's not checked. And biases can sometimes seem positive. Maybe you're predisposed, right, to like someone who sees the world like you. We want to be careful. There are explicit biases, those attitudes, things that are, thinking about an iceberg, things that are at the top that I'm fully aware of. I know I have those predispositions. I know who I vibe with and who I don't, and I can, sort of sort some of those things out. But then there's that line of consciousness, and when we dip below that line of consciousness to implicit or unconscious bias, maybe you've heard it referred to as hidden bias even, that's where the trouble begins, because those things are happening in the back of our minds. And especially in recruitment, where we're time constrained, we're making decisions left and right, our brain defaults to programming that it's had. And that programming is affected by a multitude of factors. Maybe you've walked up to the door, for example, and you've gone to push it, and it very clearly said pull, right? It's that predisposition. Maybe it's a situation where when you see a certain person, you think about that person in that way. What makes you think that? Where is that coming from? That's what we mean when we start exploring bias in its totality. Now, Christina's going to walk us through some specific factors that impact implicit bias in a deeper way and on a deeper level.
And I just want to make it really clear that sometimes Suzette and I are answering questions that are being moved to the answered column in the Q&A. And so if you're looking for some of the answers, we're typing them out and answering them there. So please make sure you're looking there. The factors that impact our implicit bias. This isn't an exhaustive list, but this is some of them. One are the identities that we already hold. The biases that are created based off of who we are and that difference that we might be experiencing out in the world. The other is our environment, whether that's where we live, where we went to school, where we work, the environments that we are taking in, what those people look like, how they identify. Those things are impacting how we show up, what they're saying, the jokes they tell, the information they know, whatever it may be. Then thinking about learned information, the stuff that maybe we were taught in school, or that we've been taught through media, or that we've been taught in the movies that we watch or TV shows that we watch. All of that is impacting your implicit bias, whether consciously or unconsciously. Our brain is taking in all of that information. Our implicit bias is also impacted by stereotypes and prejudices. So stereotypes that we hear often, right? So that you're pretty for a Black girl, and thinking that Black women aren't as pretty as white women might be a stereotype that is ingrained in our brain. Although we don't consciously believe that, it still maybe is something unconscious that shows up in our brain, or that dark skin versus light skin women are different in their beauty. But also prejudices, and that's very similar, but typically a prejudice isn't rooted in any kind of fact. It's just something that we've kind of started to believe. So what I want to do is have you all think for a second about your inputs. So if you could take a second as we go along and think about, what media do you watch? Do those people look like you? Do they identify like you? Are they different from you? What does your circle look like? The people that you're regularly engaging with, that you get advice from, that you give advice to, that you tell all of your big, exciting things and your dark secrets to. Are they the same as you? Are they different? What are the books that you read? Who writes those books? What are the topics? Is that something you already believe in? Is it different? Is it something new to you? What are the people like that you're encountering anywhere that you go? Pre-COVID, the gym, taking a walk, whatever, maybe. What do those people look like? Are they similar? Are they different? What's your neighborhood look like? How do they identify? What's your local grocery store? What do those customers look like? What do the employees look like? And if applicable for you, your religious institution. And how are those inputs impacting your implicit bias or undoing some of that implicit bias, helping you to unlearn? I'm going to kick it over to Suzette to talk us a little bit through how to unlearn our implicit bias.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I think one of the things that we also want to highlight is these are systemic issues, right? Like maybe for the first time in 2020, you heard about Juneteenth and you had never heard about it before. That's a systemic failure in the educational system that didn't teach us about those things. And when we think about the inputs, we also have to think about that all the examples that she shared have been right systems, and we can get caught in an echo chamber or a confirmation chamber. And so when we think about how to unlearn, the first step, and we love to say this, right, it's very on par with a 12-step program. Awareness. You got to be aware that there's an issue, that I have some level of implicit association. A great way, and I know Christina will drop it into the chat, the implicit association test that Harvard has is a wonderful place to start, right? And they have them of all sorts, so body type, body size, disability, etc. And so when we think about that awareness, the second piece is being able to acknowledge that it's a problem. That I know that it exists, and I can acknowledge that I don't have that cognitive conscious control over it, which means that I have to be willing to explore and expose myself. I have to be willing to explore, which doesn't mean that I ask my friends or people that I know or people that I encounter what their life is like navigating a disability, or what it's like to come out, or what it's like to be a fuller figured human, or what it's like to live with an invisible, maybe they're immunocompromised, so an invisible disability. What is it like to do that? That's not what we're talking about. There are podcasts, there are articles, there is Google. If you're on this webinar today, you have privilege in that you're educated, you're in a higher education institution environment. Be a critical consumer though, right? Be a critical consumer, make sure that you're vetting the sources, but at the same time, intentionally creating that exposure element. Are you placing yourself in positions where you are not the dominant person in that space? That's what we want you to start to begin to consider. And then commitment, that you make the commitment. We're seeing a lot of performative progress, performative allyship, statements being issued without the work being done. So we want to be careful that we're not just making a commitment, but that the truth is in the actions. Will the tree bear fruit? Will we have planted in solid ground or in loose soil? Because that's that commitment in the transition to ongoing effort. Because here's the deal, Black lives still matter, even though we're not seeing it as prominently displayed in various social media outlets. There is still a pandemic, regardless of what people may be talking about. And those are just what we're talking about now, right? So that ongoing effort, that it is a continual process. Practice makes permanent, not perfect, but permanent. I have to be willing to start my day, maybe researching something that's new to me, and end my day with something and reflecting on how that impacted me and where did my implicit associations or implicit biases come up. Journaling, tracking, panning, those are all tools for your toolbox that you can use. Christina, anything that you would tack on to that?
No, I thought it was great.
Perfect. Then we're going to transition quickly now into a couple scenarios that we just want to talk through. And we highlighted these two scenarios to talk through with you because we thought that they were most relevant. And you can use this to talk in your community and with your recruitment guides to be able to explore these further. But a chapter member is watching a P&M's pre-recorded video and begins to focus in on the background of their video. The chapter member writes in their comments the following: her background was really boring and plain. She didn't seem fun. A lot of issues going on. One, I get that many times, sometimes, right, we can space out, and so we get drawn, our eyes get drawn to other things. I recently joked when Christine and I were talking about this scenario about the fact that if I looked off in her background, I could see how organized her shelves were. And so if I were a recruiter, would I then go, oh, Christine is a very organized human, right? That's just as bad. Am I listening to what she said? Am I actively listening to what they offered in their video? Am I, if I catch myself focusing on what's in their background, do I hit stop, right? Or pause, get up, walk around, get a drink, and then come back so that I can really be intentional? We don't want to get caught up in things that aren't important, all right? We don't want to get caught up in things that aren't important. And we want to use that as an opportunity for a coachable moment. Now, the front end isn't necessarily the only place that we would see this. We can see it on the back end in the selection process. Christine is going to walk us through an example of that now.
Yeah, so during the selection process, a P&M is being discussed, and there are members in the room who are like, oh my gosh, we love her. They're gushing over her. But then another member chimes in and says she's a junior. I don't know if she's going to get along with the rest of her new member class because they're all freshmen. Honestly, how much will she be able to contribute if she's only going to be here for 2 years? And although that is 100% implicit bias showing up because we think, oh, well, if you're not here for 4 years, you're not going to be able to do anything for us. What do they add to your chapter? Could they immediately take on a position because they're a junior and they're a little bit more experienced? My best friend from my new member class was a freshman when she joined, and I joined as a junior, and we're besties for the resties, right? Like this implicit bias that we have that people aren't going to get along because they're a year and a half or 2 year difference is wild, right? And it's rooted in something that is traditional or what we've learned, but isn't always actually true. And so we have to kind of get out of this mindset that freshmen are the only people who should be joining our organizations because we are missing out on so many other people. And there's the possibility that the sophomore, junior, senior was saving up money to go through Panhellenic recruitment, or didn't know about Panhellenic recruitment because they're a first generation college student. So being really thoughtful about how we think about non-freshmen in the recruitment process. So as we wrap up our time today, I almost said tonight because I'm so used to presenting at night. As we wrap up our time today, let's talk about having difficult conversation and interrupting or disrupting problematic stuff when we see it or hear it. So first is really actively listening, making sure that you are listening to hear what they're saying and not listening to respond, y'all, because difficult conversations really should not include giving the human all of the answers. It should be, if you have the capacity, giving them grace, hearing them out, helping yourself understand where they're coming from, and then kind of deconstructing from there, right? So I always say humans try to lecture. We love to fix things. So lecturing is a really easy way to do that. However, people don't learn through lecture in a lot of ways. So many of you have probably said, I hate lecture style classes, because humans need to dialogue to learn, and they particularly need to dialogue when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so ask questions. If somebody says something problematic, you could start with, what do you mean? Put the ball back in their court to explain the problematic thing that they've said. Push them to think about the words that are coming out of their mouth. You can also say, tell me more about what you mean. Another really great piece, especially if you think implicit bias might be showing up in your rating or selection process, you can say, what's influencing that thought or feeling? So to the chapter member who said, oh, she's boring based on her background, what's influencing that thought? Get them to start using their brains to think about what they're saying and how it might be harmful or problematic. Also, when you're engaging in difficult conversations, using yes and rather than yes but. So if I say yes and Suzette, that allows for what she said and what I said to coexist to allow for that space to be created. But if I say, yes, but I'm saying, yeah, what you said is great, but what I'm saying is better, and I'm actually right. So being really thoughtful about the yes, but versus yes, and. At the end of the day, listen to folks, believe them, and gather more information. Their experience is going to be different from yours. And so even if they're saying problematic stuff, that might be rooted in something that they have no other avenue to explore or don't even realize is problematic. So canceling people isn't helpful right now, right? We have to create a space where people can be postponed, given some tools in their toolbox, and trying to help them be better. And if they still want to come to the table and say, no, I don't want to talk about this, this is dumb, okay, great. Then there's no space for you here. But canceling people just because they did something problematic when we never set the expectation to do something different, nor have we interrupted or disrupted the problematic stuff that they've done along the way, that's an issue for us. We have to take some responsibility for the humans that we have recruited, that we've allowed to be in our space, and that we've likely allowed to do problematic things before we got to the point of canceling them. So really being thoughtful about all of those things. Suzette, I'm going to kick it back over to you to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Christina. I want to take a moment first and foremost to thank the humans for being on today, right? We appreciate you. We recognize that when we know better, we do better. That's the guiding principle of the work that we're offering. We also want to acknowledge that for the questions that were not answered in the Q&A, we're going to take a minute or two to answer the most uprated questions that are at the top. But if we didn't get a chance and we don't get a chance to answer your question, we also want to honor your time as we are at or near the top of the hour. So we're only going to take a quick 5 minutes to answer a couple questions, but we will be sharing a resource that will be coming out from Panhellenic afterwards, and we're taking unanswered questions from the Q&A from Wednesday and from the Q&A today to make sure that those questions get answered. Christina, I'm going to just read off the most top-rated question. I know that we addressed this a little bit, but I think it's probably worth just answering outright. How do we move diversity beyond tokenism and create an authentic recruiting process? Do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, I'd love to reiterate shifting our focus from diversity to inclusion. If we focus on being inclusive and uplifting our sisters and highlighting them, we are very likely to avoid tokenism as much as possible. Again, we're not going to be perfect, but if we can shift to inclusivity, that's really going to help.
Thanks for that. The second piece of this, given the financial burden of dues, how can we make Greek life inclusive for all women, regardless of socioeconomic class? Here's what I just want to offer. As someone who entered the recruitment process from a lower socioeconomic class at that time, I want to challenge you to be careful about the scholarship piece and those other things, because that requires that I out myself as someone who could not financially afford to join. And you may have people who aren't ready to do that, aren't ready to share that aspect. I certainly know that my 18-year-old, well, at that time, 20-year-old, let's just be honest, as a junior, I wasn't willing to acknowledge that. And so, you know, I would say do a deeper dive. What is the value? What are our values? What is the cost of membership? What are we spending our money on? How can we be more intentional about making sure that we create an affordable experience? Do we really need the $10,000 formal? I think COVID-19 is causing us to really evaluate a lot of things in this process. And so that would be one of the things I would start with is what work backwards, right? Use a zero-based budget model. So what I mean by that is to say, what do we want to cap the expenses at for membership, and knowing that this is where we want to work from total wise, what budget would we have? And then how do we budget accordingly based on that sum of money? Christina, anything you would add to that? Perfect. And so I'm going to toss this one to you, Christina. How do you recommend making changes so that women of color, women in the LGBTQ plus community, women with disabilities, and women who have identities that typically contradict with the idea of a quote unquote typical sorority girl feel more comfortable signing up for recruitment / feel more welcome before even joining a specific Panhellenic organization?
Yeah, so I'm talking to the Panhellenic Council folks right now, and likely some of the chapter run recruitment. We got to start promoting and marketing ourselves and going out and making a grassroots effort to engage in different communities. Right now, we're like, Panhellenic recruitment's going on. Check this link. Hopefully, the humans who are following our social media is like want to come out, understanding that that's an echo chamber that you're screaming into. You're not going out to find any new people. So how could your Panhellenic Council be going around to different student organizations, telling them about Panhellenic recruitment, campaigning effectively, instead of just saying, well, hopefully you've either gone to the FSL, webpage or Greek Life page, or you follow us on social media, because y'all, first generation college students, a lot of times don't even know y'all exist. So how are you getting out in front of your student government, in front of your Black student union, in front of whatever student organization there is to say, hey, we want to tell you a little bit about the good work about Panhellenic and what we're doing, and we want you to come out and hang out with us. Don't have to do it if you don't like it. You can come for a day and then decide you want to, not do it, but we want you to come out and see what we're about. And so we have to make a conscious effort to do more than just put it up on our social media and slap the link on whatever your, office's page is, because a lot of people aren't even making it to those pages because they don't know you're out there, or they don't think you're inclusive, and so they're not coming. So how can you do a grassroots campaign to really market and sell the Panhellenic experience?
And we'll just tack on to that, also thinking about international students, right? Like, how are you making sure that it's clear to their parents, or their family, however they define family, right? Some people's friends are their family, some people are living with grandparents, some people are adopted, range of family, but that it's understood what it means to be a part of a sorority, that international students' families don't feel like they're human as joining a cult, right? So we really need to be intentional about thinking about what that looks like all inclusively. Y'all, it's been our pleasure again to spend this time with you. We will make sure that any questions that came up in the Q&A piece, that those do get answered. We certainly want to be sure that your questions get answered, and will be a part then of that resource guide if we didn't get to them on the recording today. Thank you for giving us, again, your most precious gift of time. Feel free to reach out to us directly, follow us on social media, drop into the direct message if you have an pressing question that you want to make sure that we get answered. Thanks so much.